delightful coffee is kicking in, and so I'm just like, it's a lot going on, but I promise to be a good steward of your time. Thank you for getting up extra early, if you're a night owl like me, so that you could be here. And in case if you were one of the folks that I chatted with as I was getting my third cup of coffee, I probably asked you your name and what your item was, and probably what your last name was and where your family comes from, and if your family comes from the same place that your last name comes from, because that's what I do. And I can't seem to stop. And you know what? I don't want to. So in lieu of a bio, I will give you a little bit of background about who I am and how I came to be this way. So again, I'm Rayshauna Gray, originally from Chicago on the South Side. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And I've lived in Massachusetts for about 10 years. I am a big history dork, and I pour all of my love and attention and heart for history into my work with Harvard's History Design Studio, Tufts University's History Department, and Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, the Cambridge Historical Society, and I annoy all of the old people in my family. I also annoy the children in my family, because I'm just like, do you know where we were in the 1920s? Do you have any idea, business historian at Harvard Business School, do you know that you can't teach about capitalism without teaching about enslavement? How dare you? Anyway, so let's see, where to start. I'm a pretty sappy person, and so I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you about how this foray into historical research of mine has its roots in a broken heart. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a multi-generational household on the south side of Chicago with my mama and my maternal grandparents who came up north during the Great Migration in the late 1950s. Which is why if we ever hang out and I have a couple old fashions, I will sound like I'm from Mississippi because that's who raised me, right? Like, I love to think that we're all these cultural beneficiaries, agents, and eventual ancestors, regardless of whether or not we ever have children. We are born into a world. We try our damnedest to pick up on the ways that we're socialized and how we interact with people. Hopefully, we interrogate what we value and where that comes from and how it manifests. And eventually, we'll each play an individual role in collectively passing down a world. And that is a sacred trust. And it's very hard but necessary work, in my humble opinion, especially as we stare down the specter of fascism. But I won't go too deep in this very brief presentation. The moral of that tidbit is be humane, just like try, because I'm trying. Anywho, I would like to share 3 very quick stories, anecdotes about my identity, or different facets of my identity, as someone who inherited a world, moves in it, and will eventually play a role in passing it down. So, my time with the Cambridge Historical Society has its roots in 2016, when I was an inaugural fellow. Shout out to the executive director, Marika Van Dam, who's a very fancy lady with a very adorable child. The Cambridge Historical Society, oops, there's the coffee. The Historical Society is currently based in Cambridge's Hooper Lee Nichols House, which is the second oldest house in Cambridge, right on Brattle Street along Torrey Row. And I remembered for the first time becoming aware of just how not American I felt. So I grew up in Chicago with this multi-generational household with my mama bear, maternal grandparents who sharecropped in the Mississippi Delta in the 1940s and 50s. And for the first time in my life, how do I describe this diplomatically? I felt hit over the head with history with a capital H, or by history with a capital H, when I got to Massachusetts. I had always been taught that I was, part of a nation within a nation, and that I had, been bequeathed this sacred trust of being a keeper of African American history. And when I moved here, I felt the need to broaden my horizon and get some more historical context. So during my inaugural fellowship, we take a tour of the Hooper Lee Nichols House. On the second floor, the executive director pulls back a wall, and I see a stamp from the Stamp Act era. It says paper and 5 with a little crown on it. And for the first time in my life, number one, because I'm sappy, I burst into tears. Because I had never truly thought of myself as someone who inherited that facet of United States history. And it became real to me as a grown woman who had been, one of her family's historical keepers, one of the researchers for the better part of 10 years at that point. And I remembered feeling changed by how that little image that had survived more than 200 years, I remembered the exact moment when it shifted my consciousness, when I became aware of a huge facet of my identity that I really hadn't unpacked before. And it became very apparent to me that the bar had been raised. So Sophia was gracious enough to mention my oldest item, which is the 1870 census, federal census for Coahoma County, Mississippi. And I brought some materials from my heritage box that I will hold up in your face and tell you all about after the presentation because I want you to see all of it. And the reason why this document is so important to me is because it's of course informative, it's detailed, but it's also incredibly complex. For my family, at least, they were not emancipated before the Civil War. They weren't free before the Civil War. So this 1870 census is the first record that I have where, I will not cry. Oh no, I might. Ooh. I'll try not to. Hang in there with me. Because I feel it in my chest every time I talk about it. This 1870 federal census for Coahoma County, Mississippi is the oldest record that I have where my ancestors are listed as people and not property. And it's very, very important, in my humble opinion. Voice wavering, I will not cry, because I did not bring tissue up here. Hang in there with me. It is incredibly important for me to sit with what that means in terms of how we as a collective group of people, no matter where we come from, no matter where our folks came from or what we look like, it's important for us to interrogate, I think, how we fold cruelty into our legislation, into every facet of our interpersonal interactions. And there are certain documents that exist in my heritage box that are constant reminders of that call back to a common shared humanity, which brings me from cultural beneficiary to agent. So I've served as my family's historian for roughly 15 years, and it's a role that I picked up from my maternal grandma. Bless her heart. This woman was one of 15 children, and they sharecropped in the Mississippi Delta in the 40s and 50s, and came up north to Chicago, where she married my grandpa and started a life and had some wonderful children, one of whom is my wonderful mama back home in Chicago. And I will be playing this video for her when I get back home, because she does not use the internet, so she can't see so she can't see it. Actually, this will be good. Would you mind waving for the live stream so that when I replay it, my mama will see, my mom has so many friends. Thank you. Thank you for humoring me. Her name is Sharon, and she is twice as corny as I am. She's where I get it from. And so she will love that y'all just did that, so thank you. As I move from cultural beneficiary to agent, I consider the moral imperative and social responsibility that this role as my family's historian means for me. I am constantly thinking about what I've inherited as an individual and as a member of a number of demographics that have been vulnerable throughout history. It also encourages me to constantly think about the ways that I'm socially privileged. What does it mean that despite being a descendant of enslaved folks and sharecroppers, I'm also documented as a result of some of those same amendments that shifted the course of US history? What does that mean for me in terms of how I handle people with care, and how I, remain remain intent on broadening my horizons as often and as deeply and intentionally as humanly possible? For the folks that I chopped it up with before we all sat down with your lovely faces, I kept thinking about how much of a gift it is that we're all in the same room right now. When some of you, and I can't see your faces because I'm short, but when some of you were telling me things like, I live in the North End in a building that dates back to the mid-19th century, it made me think not just of you, but of all the folks that have inhabited the space that came before you. Oh no, tears, okay. Can you all tell this stuff is in my heart? Anyway, I'm constantly thinking about all of the circumstances that had to unfold exactly the way they did, when they did, to not just leave room for our existence. Oh no, chest. To not just leave room for our existence, but that set the tone for all of us literally being in the same space right now. I think about folks who immigrated willingly, people who were fleeing certain social circumstances that were beyond their control. I think about the ways that we engineer society generation by generation and what it means that we preserve certain things and completely dismantle others. How we decide, or how we discern the difference and how we decide what to construct and what to break down. And so basically, I'm in love with all of you. You are all my cousins. Which brings us from cultural beneficiary and agent to eventual ancestor. I believe, again, that history is a sacred trust. And so if, I as a Black cis woman who has a certain collection of identities is the keeper, the bearer of a story and a narrative, it's my responsibility to ensure that what gets passed down, insofar as I'm able, is not only found, but robust, multifaceted, and meaningful. If I am documenting the life of someone who's gender nonconforming or trans, I have a responsibility to flesh that out with an oral history interview and try to ascertain meaning and intentionally gather as much of their story as humanly possible, because I know what happens when people fall through the cracks in a record. I know what happens when we don't know our history. I know how vulnerable we are and how dangerous it is when we don't pass down the stories that need to be shared. It is my fervent hope that each of you, how do I say this without sounding bossy? One moment. It is my fervent hope that each of you find your authentic, unique way to move in the world as a cultural beneficiary, agent, and eventual ancestor. And for some of you, that will mean using your aesthetic, creative design skills to interpret history in a new way, or to talk about different facets of your identity in a way that's radical and intentional and worldview expanding. It is, or I'll say this, it was an extreme honor to be part of Harvard's History Design Studio's most recent cohort, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't just a cultural beneficiary and an eventual ancestor, but I was an individual human being. And as I write this book about the last 2 centuries of US history through 7 generations of women in my family, elevator pitch, I've been practicing, each of us, we get our own chapter written out of the year we were 31. And so for the first time in my life, I'm thinking about 1851 from 2019 and trying my best to figure out what my 4th great-grandma Martha, whose name is on the census record that I'll show you, wondering what the world was like for her, right? Finding kinship with people who lived lives long before I ever came on the scene. It became so important for me during my fellowship at the History Design Studio to not just think of myself in terms of my bookend identities, but it means so much for me to place myself, to assume my rightful place in this 200-year-long historical narrative and to make good on so much of the work done by people who came before me. And so, yeah, I would strongly encourage each of you to consider how you're uniquely equipped to gather, to interpret, to bond with other people, to close these gaps, and to complicate narratives. And that will often mean thinking of yourself in terms of someone who will bequeath something to someone else. And whether you are a wonderful person who brought your mug and is eco-friendly, or you're someone like me who makes people uncomfortable at bars when they ask about your research, because I'm like, hey, well, it's a little awkward, but I promise you there's a way to talk about debt peonage and westward expansion over old fashions. It's possible. You can do it. I believe we have the cultural courage to have the difficult conversations. And honestly, as you go about this work and as you think about your unique inclinations and abilities and opportunities to preserve your own stories, it becomes so clear to me how people become changed in the process. I realized 15 years in at this point, which is roughly half my life, I feel like I'm 80 though. Anyway, I realized that everything from my attitudes toward other people, all of my cousins here, and the ways that I interpreted the world, I was changed by this process. None of you are strangers to me. I am, how do I say this? This decade and a half long process has changed my questions. My questions are no longer, why don't I have this? Or why do certain microaggressions happen to me? And of course, these are very important questions. It's important to interrogate how we live and why and all that jazz. But there was a critical tipping point when my questions became, how am I uniquely equipped to contribute a verse in this human conversation? How or in what ways has my heart been hardened to certain people and certain sets of circumstances? How have I been socialized to not see people fully or hold space for them in a way that's not ego-driven at all? And how can I change for the better? And I think that's what a preservation mindset equips us to do. I'll say this, and I'm sure you can hear in my voice that I'm trying my best to be diplomatic. I believe that we are socialized here in the States to want what we want when we want it. I believe that we are encouraged to value things that are quick and easy and convenient, and that's wonderful, because I don't know about y'all, but I have 4 jobs. And sometimes I just want to sit down somewhere, and I want to talk about Outlander that just got to Netflix. Right? And I want to talk about how fine the male protagonist is. Y'all, I'm so silly. I'm gonna blame the coffee. But basically, it becomes clear to me that that this is the hard but necessary work. And I believe that there's value in these very difficult, tender places. And I think that a preservation mindset enables us to, cultivate and sustain enough moral courage and temerity to do this work. I think that the work of interrogating how you've been socialized and becoming intentional about certain positive changes is exhausting. But knowing that one day, not to be morbid, but this is kind of what I do, one day, all you beautiful, wonderful folks will be as not here as you were before. Now, maybe something that you owned or created, especially like your digital footprint, so be sure to tweet mindfully, because you don't know who'll come after us 400 years from now and then see all the mess, why did you post your butt? Listen, butts are nice. I'm sure your butt is nice, but one day your work or your footprint will have to speak on your behalf. And so I hope, how do I say this? It is my fervent hope that you become as cursed as I am, and that history is always on my left shoulder, right? I'm always thinking about what I will leave behind, what it might mean, how it might meet people that I'll never meet. As I write this book, I'm thinking about a distant relative living 2 centuries into the future. It is my fervent hope that when if I'm so fortunate that the book still exists and it might be in print or somebody finds it, it's my fervent hope that it gives them ballast, right? That it enables them to live in a world that might not speak their language, right? But I hope that it will restore their humanity the way that this process is restoring mine. Because and this is the reason why I tend to make people uncomfortable at bars, but I believe that just like, we're born into a world, live in it, and we'll pass away, I believe that systems of oppression and interpersonal stuff is inherited, built upon, and passed down. I believe that they're natural extensions of these huge human questions. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to live in community? How do we engineer a more humane society? How do we course correct when we figure out that we're not exactly living the way that we feel called to live? And how do we protect ourselves from people who decide to live that way intentionally? I've never been in the business of telling people what to do. So I don't have a charge for you, but it is my fervent hope that you're transformed by these very difficult but necessary questions. We don't know who will be here centuries from now, but I hope that you're living in a way that's authentic and meaningful. I hope that you're fighting for your mind and your humanity and that you're insisting constantly upon both of them. Let's see, how do I want to finish? I'll finish this way. Would you all humor me again and please close your eyes and listen to my voice? Close them eyes, close them eyes. Unless you're like, somebody's gonna steal my wallet. In which case, I don't blame you. You can like crack and keep it open. So, as you shut your beautiful eyes, please, if you know this information, please think about all of the folks who boarded a boat willingly, all of the folks who immigrated by boat or by plane, all of the people who are here because of circumstances that were beyond their control. Maybe your folks are from Poland. Maybe they're from the Ukraine. Maybe they're from Mississippi, like mine. You know, maybe they were fleeing circumstances that were beyond their control. Maybe they did it for love. Oh my gosh, you all look so wonderful. I'm trying not to get sappy. Again, more. Yeah, think about someone tethered to you, maybe not by blood, but someone tethered to you who's living 2 centuries into the future. Consider their cultural circumstances. Think of ways that you're uniquely equipped to send comfort to them into the future. If you're part of a community that's socially vulnerable, consider what writing yourself into history might look like. Maybe you're a visual artist. Maybe you are an annoying writer like me. Maybe you're a researcher who has the temerity to sit with life's difficult questions. Thanks for playing along, folks.